Good morning, afternoon, evening, night, or whatever other time of day it is for you. Midnight, I don't know, dawn. We are going to be looking at the 1988 Atlantic hurricane season in this video. On paper, um, there is one oddity you can spot, that being no formation of storms in June or July. But other than that, really active August and September and even October, kind of. With three storms at least in October, not forming. There was two in October. You know what I mean. Um, October being more of a waning month here in the northern hemisphere in the Atlantic, but what I mean is that overall, remarkably average. So, what makes this season so significant? Well, I hope that by the very end you'll understand why. But first, we had a accumulated cyclone energy, or ACE for short, of 102.99. This is practically the perfect 30-year average, with that average being 103, so literally just zero point zero 0.01 off. Essentially as perfect as you can get with nature's randomness. And this season had a very average, near perfect average, in fact, storm total as well, with 12 storms, 5 hurricanes, and 3 major hurricanes. Also, essentially, the 30-year average. However, though, the season would cause the deaths of anywhere from 600 to 700 people and see roughly $5 billion in damage. The first storm we're going to look over here is Hurricane Debby. Hurricane Debby, as you can see, is a crossover system, which is pretty remarkable, as this does not happen too often along any part of Mexico or Central America for that matter. So let's see how this happened. Debby first started off, of course, as a tropical depression, that being TD8 on the 31st of August, and was determined to be a tropical depression via satellite imagery and the Dvorak number scale. This is a scale that I have gone over before in a different videos a little while back. If I remember, I apologize sincerely if I don't. I will have that video linked in the description. Please don't hold me on that, as I tend to forget things pretty easily. So if I don't, I'm very sorry. In any case, Debby would become a tropical storm anywhere on the 1st to the 2nd of October, or sorry, September. The date isn't exactly known, but at least become a hurricane on the 2nd of September. Debby was only a hurricane for a short time, however, still peaked just off the coast of Mexico, like 35 miles off the coast of Mexico, peaking at 80 miles per hour and at 991 millibars, so a relatively higher pressure storm here. Of course, it was still a hurricane though. Debby would landfall on the Tuxpan district, specifically Veracruz, Mexico. This would be the very first. Um, this would be the very first landfall on the Veracruz district. Sorry, not Tuxpan. Tuxpan is a city. Veracruz is a district, I think. This would be the very first landfall on the Veracruz district of Mexico, or province, I believe it is. My apologies. The Veracruz province since 1956. So it had been, what, 32 years since the last landfall here. I'll definitely take that, as it's a lot less common than Florida, I'll say that for sure. Debby managed to surprisingly again survive the trek across Mexico, although not re-emerging as a storm or even hurricane, of course, just as a tropical depression. However, in my eyes, Debby still survives this crossover, not just being a remnant. Debby would make a curve to the northwest and was appearing to head up the Gulf of California. However, it dissipated just at the start of the Gulf of California on the 8th of September. Debby would cause some pretty severe rains, as we can see here, measuring anywhere normally from, I'll say, 3 to all the way up to 26 inches in Tapek, Mexico. That, of course, being an outlier there. All this rain, however, would cause the Tuxpan River to burst at Alamo, I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Alamo, not the one further north in Texas. I know that. I think there would be 20 deaths as well from Debbie, most of them being from landslides. A very short one here. TD10, Tropical Depression 10. This thing very rapidly developed into a tropical system on the 4th of September, peaking only at roughly 35 miles per hour. Some sources listed 30, but I found 35 more commonly. At a high pressure of 1,002 millibars. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, actually, this is the first system I've covered to have a minimum pressure of over 1,000 millibars. So, ha ha ha, look at that. TD10 moved to the practical east here and generated only 6 hours later, merging with the very same cold front that caused its formation. TD10's remnants, however, would bring more than 8 inches of rain to Mississippi. Lord knows if they needed it or not. I didn't check. And TD10, if I'm not mistaken, is one of, if not the shortest lived tropical system in the possibly ever, although for certain one of the shortest lived in the entirety of the Atlantic basin. So, kind of an oddity there that I just wanted to showcase. Hurricane Florence, though, this is a real storm now, not this baby wimpy TD10. Hurricane Florence was created by a cold front splitting in two, possibly the same one that formed and also was merged into by TD10, although I couldn't find that for certain. And this was created on the 7th of September. And it also became a tropical storm on the very same day. Due to some interactions with other storms, as well as actually some water currents too, Florence would stall for just a little bit out in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico before then finally being pushed northwards. From here on, it became a hurricane pretty quickly, doing so on the 10th of September, and Florence would peak and landfall on this day. This peak was at 80 miles per hour at a pressure of 982 millibars. Florence would also very quickly dissipate, doing so on just the 11th of September. Florence would cause some moderate flooding in Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and even Florida, and would also leave over 100,000 without power. Thankfully, though, this power was restored relatively quickly. Florence, however, is still responsible for one direct death and $2.9 million in damage. Hurricane Gilbert of 1988 is, of course, a very famous storm, and for good reason. In fact, I will be making a individual video for Hurricane Gilbert. This is a monumental storm, and for very good reason. Hurricane Gilbert, though, of course, started off as a depression. It started off as TD12 on the 8th of September and was seen to become a tropical storm anywhere from the 9th to the 10th of September. That's not exactly known, but what is known is that Gilbert became a hurricane late on the 10th of September and then became a major hurricane. That's what the MH stands for here, just the very next day. So we are now seeing some very rapid intensification. Now then, Gilbert after this makes landfall on Jamaica on the 12th of September, this landfall being at 125 miles per hour at a low pressure of 960 millibars with a roughly 24-kilometer wide eye. That is a mile number that I forget. I'm sorry about that. I tried to remember so hard, and then I had more information about this and it got shoved out of my brain. In any case, I can tell you what I do know. Gilbert would peak as a Category 5 on the 14th of September, reaching a staggering 185 miles per hour at a pressure of 885 millibars. But wait, that isn't right. Technically, it was to the drop zone. A little bit of a tangent here. The hurricane hunters' dropsondes at the time, these instruments that they drop into hurricanes, tended to favor a slight had a slight tendency towards lower pressures. The actual corrected pressure of Gilbert's is 888 millibars. However, I at least wanted to put this 885 out there because I found that interesting because it shows that equipment can have tendencies or slight deviations to the normal. That just I found interesting. Back on track. Gilbert landfell on both Cozumel Island and the Yucatan Peninsula, also on the 14th of September, at practically this peak as well, from 185 to 180 miles per hour. Gilbert would weaken pretty significantly down to around Category 2 after the Yucatan Peninsula due to land friction. However, intensified right back up, landfalling for the last time on Tamaulipas, Mexico, at 125 miles per hour on the 16th of September. Gilbert then took a very abrupt turn to the north and the northeast, where it would spawn more than 20, in fact, close to 30 tornadoes in Texas, and it dissipated on the 19th. I say dissipated because Gilbert was last seen merging with a cold front right over the Great Lakes. Note that Hurricane Gilbert is the very worst storm for Jamaica still today and was the worst since 1951's Charley. Gilbert is responsible for 318 deaths and nearly 3 billion US dollars in damage. That, of course, being in 1988 US dollars. Hurricane Joan and Miriam. Hurricane Joan Miriam is a very interesting one here. As we can see, another crossover storm. Very interesting. Joan became a TD, that being TD 17, on the 10th of October, being a tropical storm just 12 hours later. Joan was a tropical storm for a very long time, though finally, upon close to reaching Central America, became a hurricane approximately the 15th. After a brief stint as a Category 3, it performed a very tight counterclockwise loop, that being some interactions with other low pressures as well as some trade winds interfering in everything. Complicated business, as usual. Joan would then continue along on its track westward, and it would also be around this point that upwelling currents, so cold ocean currents coming upwards, would also weaken Joan here as well. Joan, however, would recover pretty quickly from this, peaking on around the 17th, reaching Category 4 status, 145 miles per hour at 932 millibars, this being the minimum pressure in the Atlantic, the minimum in the Pacific being a lot higher than that, I'll say. Joan would landfall on Bluefields, Nicaragua at around its peak strength, around 145 miles per hour. Joan would emerge into the Pacific as a tropical storm, and due to procedure at the time, called for a rename, something that is thankfully no longer done today, as that causes confusion. Due to this, Joan was renamed to Miriam and continued on its westward track, going all the way into the Pacific, yada yada yada, dissipating on the 2nd of November, having a almost month-long life in total. Interestingly, Hurricane Joan would be the lowest latitude Category 4 up until 2004's Hurricane Ivan. That is what, 18 years, something like that. Almost. No, what? That is almost 40 years. Sorry, my math is very bad in my head. Joan Miriam is responsible for 200 to 300 deaths at an estimated $2 billion in damage. So I hope that I've shown y'all just how significant this season was. In fact, to recap, we had no storm formation in both June and July. Yes, we have TD1 here. However, TD1 formed on the 31st of May and dissipated around the 3rd to 5th of June. I forget. So again, no storm formation here in the first 2 months. We also had 15 storms landfall, or at least affect land in some way, shape, or form. This was also the very first season in the entirety of the documented Atlantic hurricane season history with more than one crossover storm. Of course, the farther and farther you look back, the worse and worse the records get, as technology is always improving with time. So there are caveats to this. That is not saying that this has never happened before. It is just the first documented instance of this happening, which is still impressive and worth noting. This was also, to my surprise, the best overall forecasted season up until 1996. I have of course, all of the sources that I have will be in the description, but I'll definitely highlight this one. This one shows the error percentage for 24, 48, and like 96-hour forecasts. And we see it being so much lower than 1987 and 1989. From there on out, we see small improvements, and then 1996 is one of the best forecasted seasons, beating, of course, 88. And I've just found that very impressive, possibly due to the low number of storms the season had. That is true. There are some caveats to this being being the best forecasted as well. There's caveats to everything in weather. So who knows? But that was something very interesting. Looking at individual storms now, Tropical Storm Alberto, if I'm not mistaken, still holds the record to this day of being the northernmost formed tropical system in Atlantic history, with it forming at 41.5 degrees north. Obviously, a lot higher than normal. Although Hurricane Debby is not listed as a crossover storm, surprisingly, from everything I've found, at least on Wikipedia, I am still counting Debby as a crossover, which makes it the very first crossover storm since 1978's Greta. That's right, it had been a full decade since a crossover storm from Atlantic to Pacific. Um, don't ask if there are Pacific to Atlantic crossovers. They're not. Trade winds don't allow that. Gilbert is to this at Gilbert was, sorry, at the time the lowest pressure system in the entirety of the Atlantic. However, currently, as of 2024, that is before the 2024 hurricane season. This is February, right? Sorry, March right now. It's March 5th. The Gilbert is the second lowest, holds the second lowest pressure in the entirety of the Atlantic basin at 888 millibars. Note also Joan's very unusual track. Joan was extremely low latitude, especially for the time that it formed, being in October. Joan is, sorry, rather I'll say normally in October, November, the high pressures tended to move further south, which causes storms to be further north. However, this was not the case in 88, so Joan was a very southerly tracked storm. Note also, lastly, that the storm names of Gilbert and Joan would be retired and, of course, replaced. And that is all, folks, that I have for the 1988 Atlantic hurricane season. I hope that you all learned some things from this video, because I certainly did while researching it. Again, all of the sources that I have will be right in the description, and I hope to see you all in the next one. Thank you all so much for watching.